Written by A.I. The Tyranny of the Modern American State, a syncretic critique with focus on the Trump era. Introduction. Toward a political critique beyond left and right. Many political critiques today are trapped within the binary of left versus right, but a deeper diagnosis of modern American governance must transcend that frame. What I propose here is a syncretic, hybrid political philosophy, one that honors individual liberty, ecological stewardship, civic virtue, and decentralization, while refusing both rigid libertarianism and top-down managerial progressivism. From that vantage, one can more piercingly discern the gravitational pull of tyranny in the American system, and, specifically, the Trump administration's many incursions against constitutional order, civil liberties, and institutional legitimacy. In doing so, I aim also to sketch a bold alternative, the Cascadia plant by Ghost Liberty, as a principled, constructive path of resistance and renewal. To get there, we must ground ourselves historically and philosophically. We must revisit Spooner's natural rights radicalism, Patrick Henry's urgency about centralized power, Jefferson's decentralism, Madison's structural constraints on government, Jackson's populist challenges, and Kennedy's civic call. When we place the Trump presidency in that lineage, we see how modern tyranny is not a historical aberration but the culmination of recurring patterns of federal overreach, institutional decay, and executive aggrandizement. Philosophical foundations of critique. Lysander Spooner. Natural rights, social contract, and the illegitimacy of governmental violence. Lysander Spooner's radical clarity remains a lodestar for any serious critique of state power. He insisted that individuals possess natural rights that no majority or constitution may abrogate, and that any government violating those rights becomes illegitimate, a mere usurper rather than a rightful authority. In No Treason 1870, he argued that the social contract is not a real, enforceable obligation but a moral fiction. You do not owe obedience to a government simply because it claims legitimacy, especially if it's coercive and violates individual rights. From Spooner's vantage, a government that prosecutes or suppresses protest, or orders arrests without due process, is not fulfilling a noble social compact but acting as a tyrant. The theory of consent by continued residence is weak. Silent acquiescence is not the same as consent, especially when dissent is punished. Thus, Spooner gives us a philosophical standard. No government has moral standing that violates natural rights, however it dresses itself in law. Patrick Henry. The peril of consolidated power. Patrick Henry's famous cry, "Give me liberty or give me death," evokes more than rhetorical fervor. It encapsulates a perennial warning. Once government centralizes too much power, it becomes a predator on freedom. Henry feared that consolidated government would swallow local autonomy, stifle dissent, and substitute coercion for persuasion. He understood that liberty is fragile, and that patriotic vigilance is needed to guard against the drift toward executive or bureaucratic overreach. His words remind us that the only enduring objective is not to enlarge government, but to constrain it, lest the cost be the slow, deadly erosion of liberty. Thomas Jefferson. Localism, individual liberty, and distrust of central power. Jefferson's political doctrine emphasizes that political power should be as local as practicable. The smaller the unit of government, the more likely citizens can restrain it, oversee it, and prevent abuses. He feared distant, centralized government, especially one allied with mercantile interests or military power. Key Jeffersonian precepts. The role of government is minimal. Protect life, liberty, property, and facilitate free exchange. Anything beyond that invites corruption. The diffusion of power, states, counties, municipalities, civil societies, is essential to prevent tyranny. An educated, virtuous citizenry is indispensable to self-rule. Thus any modern government that concentrates power in Washington, subordinates local sovereignty, and wields federal coercion becomes suspect in Jefferson's frame. James Madison. Checks, separation, and structural self-limitation. Madison is often invoked as a bulwark against tyranny, and rightly so. In Federalist No. 51, he argues that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The structure of separated powers, with mutual oversight, was designed precisely to prevent any one branch from trampling liberties. Madison's lessons. 1. Institutional checks and balances are not ornament, but vital constraints. 2. Federalism is designed to divide sovereignty, leaving meaningful power with subnational entities. 3. Even majorities must be constrained. Rights must be protected against the tyranny of the majority, e.g., through constitutional guarantees. From Madison's lens, the real danger is not just tyranny by despot, but tyranny through institutional capture, majoritarian blitz, or executive usurpation. Andrew Jackson. Populist resistance and institutional challenge. Andrew Jackson is a more ambivalent figure, but his populist energy offers an instructive model of pushing back against entrenched elites. Jackson challenged the Second Bank of the United States, viewed federal elites as disconnected, and appealed directly to the people, disrupting established institutional power. Lessons from Jackson. Institutional legitimacy must derive from popular trust. When elites ossify or become unaccountable, disruption is justified. The presidency, while potentially dangerous, can also act as a counterweight to entrenched interest, but only if constrained by law and civic virtue. Jackson shows the tension. One must resist institutional overreach, but also guard against the transformation of the executive into a personalistic dynastic center. John F. Kennedy. Civic responsibility, constitutional freedom, and the call to action. Kennedy's rhetorical and moral legacy centers on civic responsibility, a rising tide of global responsibility, and a constantly renewed defense of constitutional freedoms. He believed that freedom is not a spectator sport, that citizens must engage, push back, hold accountable, and energize the institutions of democracy. From Kennedy. The vitality of democracy depends on an active, informed public, not passive obedience. Constitutional freedom must be defended daily, not merely by courts, but by citizen action. The executive must not treat dissent as disloyalty. Freedom of speech, assembly, and petition are indispensable bulwarks. Hence Kennedy's spirit is antithetical to authoritarianism masquerading as order. He invites constant vigilance and resistance. A historical pattern, federal overreach, state encroachment, and the illusion of consent. To see modern tyranny clearly, we need a historical thread. While the U.S. Constitution is often praised as a defense against government excess, in practice the federal government has repeatedly encroached, especially when majoritarian impulses, war, or national crises press. One stark episode: the Civil War in Abraham Lincoln. From our syncretic vantage, Lincoln's unilateral suppression of secession should be recognized, not only as a tragic necessity in Union preservation, but also as a paradigmatic moment in which the national government usurped states' claimed right to withdraw from an oppressive federal compact. In doing so, Lincoln set a precedent. The federal government overrules state dissents when it claims crisis, and thereby reinforces a continual trajectory of centralization. In short, federal overreach is not an incidental anomaly but a structural pull in American constitutional history. The dynamic is: 1. Crisis or perceived crisis, war, rebellion, terrorism, is invoked. 2. The executive claims extraordinary powers, suspension of habeas corpus, martial law, nationalization. 3. Subnational dissent is overridden, constitutional checks are minimized. 4. The new flexibility becomes normalized, expanding the executive's baseline authority. Thus the insight: Abraham Lincoln's usurpation of the states' right to secede when they perceived a tyrannical government exemplifies the perennial federal encroachment against jurisdictional sovereignty and individual liberty. Over time, each decade has seen executive creep, from Reconstruction, to Prohibition-era enforcement, to New Deal centralization, to Cold War security states, to post-9/11 expansion, and now to the Trumpian presidency. The accumulation of precedents weakens constitutional fences, shifts public expectations, and erodes the lived boundary between state coercion and individual autonomy. The Trump administration. Patterns of tyranny in practice. Let us now examine verified instances where the Trump administration's actions arguably violated constitutional principles, and illustrate how they concretely represent modern tyranny. The intent here is not name-calling but structural diagnosis. The evidence comes from press reporting, court rulings, and public record. Militarized and unconstitutional deployments of federal forces violating the 10th Amendment, posse comitatus. One of the most striking features of the Trump era is the deployment of National Guard or federalized troops into cities without the consent of state governors or legislatures. These interventions breach the 10th Amendment's reservation of police powers to states, and in many cases run afoul of the Posse Comitatus Act by blending military forces with domestic law enforcement. In 2025, as protests erupted in places like Los Angeles, Portland, and Chicago, the Trump administration federalized National Guard troops and deployed them into local jurisdictions allegedly to protect federal property or suppress immigration-related unrest. Legal challenges followed. In Los Angeles, a federal judge, Charles Breyer, eventually ruled that the deployment violated the Posse Comitatus Act and exceeded presidential authority. In Oregon and California, the federalization of troops was challenged in court. A district judge issued a temporary restraining order against deploying out-of-state National Guard forces into Portland, citing the administration's lack of factual justification and violation of states' rights. The ACLU has warned the administration is building a de facto national paramilitary policing force, circumventing accountability to citizens. In D.C., Trump in 2025 signed an executive order declaring a crime emergency and switched control of the Metropolitan Police Department from local to federal control, deploying federal forces, despite crime statistics being near 30-year lows. These episodes illustrate an assertion of federal executive power over local sovereignty, with only rhetorical claims of emergency as justification. This is precisely the kind of centralization Patrick Henry warned against, and Jefferson would have rejected. Warrantless searches, detentions, and violence against protesters, immigrants contravening the Fourth and First Amendments. Another realm of tyranny is the suppression of individual rights via force and due process evasion. In Portland, city authorities have accused federal officers of using force against otherwise peaceful demonstrators, violating their Fourth Amendment rights, unreasonable searches and seizures, and First Amendment rights, peaceful assembly. The ACLU has documented cases in which masked agents arrested people for immigration violations without warrants, even U.S. citizens, and used aggressive tactics, tear gas, flashbang grenades, raids in residential neighborhoods. In Los Angeles, reports exist of federal agents targeting journalists with crowd control weapons, disturbing press freedoms. A federal judge has since curtailed DHS and LAPD actions to limit harm to journalists. On the immigrant rights front, non-citizen protesters have been targeted for deportation in part because of their advocacy. A Boston court ruled that the Trump administration unconstitutionally targeted non-citizens for deportation for pro-Palestinian protest activity, thus chilling First Amendment speech. The case of Mahmoud Khalil, a Columbia University student, is instructive. He was forcibly removed by ICE agents from his residence because of his activist work. Legal proceedings are ongoing implicating First Amendment and procedural due process claims. In these instances, the executive branch operates with impunity, subordinating constitutional safeguards to its own enforcement agenda. Suppression of free speech, politicized prosecution, and intimidation of judges. In a more overtly political vein, the Trump administration has engaged in suppression of dissent, orchestrated legal pressure on critics, and instigated intimidation of judicial actors. The case of Alex Jones and InfoWars is often cited. The Trump-aligned push to litigate Jones for defamation involved politically charged courts, raising concerns about selective prosecution of dissenters. While Jones is far from an ideal champion, the tactic matters, using court mechanisms to silence or financially punish opposition. Judges themselves have been threatened or harassed. While the example of Judge Diane Goodstein is less well documented in the mainstream press, it is publicly known that the Trump administration has made pointed attacks against judiciary figures perceived as unfriendly, sometimes demanding loyalty or suggesting punishment. These acts intimidate rather than persuade, thereby undermining judicial independence. More broadly, the rhetoric of enemy of the people, attacks on fake judges, and hints of prosecution of critics conspires to chill speech and impede dissent. These are not aberrations, they are systemic tools of authoritarian control, deployed under the guise of legalism. subversion of electoral process and the January 6 insurrection. Perhaps the most acute instance of attempted tyrannical subversion is the Trump campaign's efforts to overturn the 2020 election and the culminating January 6, 2021 assault on the Capitol. The Trump administration and allies undertook a broad effort to delegitimize the certified results of the election, pressuring state officials, deploying claims of fraud, and proposing alternate slates of electors. This was not a mere political strategy but an attempt to nullify lawful votes. On January 6, the violent storming of the U.S. Capitol, which resulted in multiple deaths, extensive property damage, and trauma to the idea of peaceful transfer of power, was fomented by sustained claims of election theft. The insurrection sought to physically prevent the certification of lawful results. While some of that violence was spontaneous, much was centrally encouraged and condoned, and the vacuum of accountability and executive resistance to institutional constraint speaks to the crisis of legitimacy. The direct result was a deepening trust crisis in institutions, polarizing the electorate, and raising the specter of force over law. To treat this event merely as a riot is to minimize its constitutional meaning. It was an effort to install executive will over institutional process. Authoritarian executive actions undermining checks and congressional authority. In addition to dramatic episodes, the Trump era has shown myriad smaller but cumulatively dangerous examples of executive overreach. The use of emergency declarations to bypass Congress on funding or to repurpose resources, e.g. border wall funding reallocation, sets precedents for executive appropriation. Attempts to weaponize federal agencies, DOJ, DHS, to target perceived political opponents, bypassing oversight mechanisms. Resistance to congressional subpoenas, refusal to cooperate with investigations, and stalling tactics that attempt to starve legislative authority of information and leverage. These moves reflect a one-man executive logic, that constraints are irritants to be negotiated, outflanked, or overridden rather than honored. Diagnosing the crisis, constitutional decay, political violence, and institutional illegitimacy. The Trump presidency did not invent American tyranny, but it exemplified what happens when numerous guardrails are eroded. The current crisis is not ephemeral. We are now contending with 1. Institutional illegitimacy. When executives treat courts, Congress, and local governments as inconveniences rather than legitimate co-equal actors, citizens lose trust. An administration that sues states, deploys troops to override governors, and ignores subpoenas weakens the idea that institutions are legitimate, not just under assault. 2. Escalating partisan violence and threat of civil fracture. The normalization of protest policing, deployment of paramilitary units, and acceptance of political violence, as on January 6, indicates that force is becoming a standard tool of politics. If the political system offers no legal recourse, disaffected parts of society may resort to extra-institutional means. 3. Misinformation, judicial assassinations, and legal suppression. When courts themselves become battlegrounds of political warfare, with threats to judges, aggressive prosecutions of critics, and media suppression, the rule of law dissolves into factional war. 4. Centralization and erosion of local autonomy. The steady shift of power upward, from local to state to federal, concentrates coercive capacity in fewer hands. The further removed power is from citizens, the more the state becomes alien, opaque, and unaccountable. If left unchecked, this trajectory leads toward a bifurcated society, one in which citizens either acquiesce to disguised authoritarianism or retreat into isolated enclaves or even rebellion. The urgent question: can we reboot institutional legitimacy from within, or must we build anew from the ground up? The Cascadia Plan offers one such strategic vision. The Cascadia Plan, a syncretic alternative of freedom, ecology, and open governance. Let me now turn to the ambitious political philosophical project you requested, the Cascadia Plan, initiated by Ghost Liberty Alexander Conniff. Though still nascent and partly speculative, it offers a bold, constructive anchor for the kind of political realignment we desperately need. Origins and principles. Cascadia is conceived as a micronation, secessionist initiative rooted in open-source governance, transparency, sustainability, and local sovereignty. The project envisions using 10th Amendment principles and a convention of the states to peacefully withdraw from the federal yoke and constitute a new polity in the Pacific Northwest, the Cascadia bioregion. Its governance philosophy is decentralized, delegative, democratic, open source, transparent, and locally empowered. It emphasizes ecological stewardship, carbon neutrality, watershed-based planning, resilience, experimental institutionalism, and progressive libertarian values, balance of individual liberty and social justice. In short, Cascadia is not a caricature of secessionist extremism, but a reasoned blueprint for renewing political legitimacy from the bottom up. Constitutional design and rights protection. The proposed Cascadian Constitution would enshrine rigorous protections: free speech, free arms, subject to local regulation, assembly, property, petition, and due process. These rights would not be subject to majoritarian override. Sovereignty would be meaningfully devolved. Local jurisdictions, municipal, and regional units retain real decision-making over taxation, regulation, policing, and land use. Central authority would be minimal, with enumerated powers only. Institutions would be open source. Citizens could inspect code of digital governance systems, transact votes transparently, audit records, propose laws, and participate in governance at multiple levels. Militias, military forces, or centrally controlled police would be tightly constrained, or outright rejected, to prevent the very militarization we see under Trump. Cascadia aims to disaggregate coercive power and put it under community oversight. Secession, legitimacy, and peaceful transition. Cascadia advocates peaceful, democratic secession, anchored in popular consent, negotiated transitions, and constitutional processes. It rejects violent revolution as both unethical and strategically risky. The plan is to build legitimacy first in parallel, demarcate boundary, form provisional institutions, win popular allegiance, and then dissolve union ties, ideally via constitutional convention efforts and negotiated withdrawal. To skeptics, this is neither escapism nor isolationism. Cascadia would still engage with neighboring states, trade, treaty, and federated associations, but from a basis of sovereignty and autonomous institutional integrity. Regional resilience and holistic renewal. Cascadia is also a bioregional ecological project. Governance corresponds to watersheds, ecological units, and local sustainability imperatives, not solely lines drawn by historical states. Social and economic justice are integral. Property rights must be balanced with responsibilities, and governance must prevent concentration of wealth from corroding political equality. Institutional resilience is built in. Overlapping jurisdictions, redundancy, fallback systems, cross-community exchange, and civic education are part of the foundational design. Appeal to independent centrists and individualists. Why would someone skeptical of the left or the right be drawn to Cascadia? 1. Transcendence of political binaries. Cascadia is not a left-wing utopia nor a libertarian fantasy. It is a hybrid, practical synthesis of individual autonomy, ecological sustainability, and participatory governance. 2. Ground-up legitimacy. Rather than relying on national elites or ideological camps, Cascadia speaks to the independent-minded citizen. Shape your own institutions, guard your own rights, resist hierarchical imposition. 3. Protection from authoritarian drift. In a small, transparent polity, the usual tools of executive aggrandizement are harder to hide. The structures themselves discourage power accretion. 4. Ecological rationality. In an era of climate crisis, a bioregional polity grounded in sustainability resonates with those who see that the two dominant parties abandon long-term stewardship. 5. Peaceful realism. Cascadia does not ask for immediate triumphs but for gradual legitimacy building, which is far more plausible than expecting a corrupt system to reform itself. Risks, objections, and rebuttals. Certainly Cascadia is not without difficulties. Practical viability. Can a seceded region manage defense, currency, trade, and diplomatic burdens? Possibly through federation, trade pacts, shared services, and robust civil society. Retaliation, suppression. The U.S. could resist secession aggressively. Cascadia's strategy must emphasize legal, peaceful methods, and build resilience before confrontation. Internal capture. Even in small polities, elites may coalesce. The open source, designed before power ethos is meant to mitigate that, but constant vigilance is needed. Secession is divisive. Some will argue it fragments the nation or is illegitimate. But when the old institutions abandon legitimacy and rights, secession may be the least unjust path. I do not present Cascadia as a guaranteed panacea, but as the only coherent alternative among currently visible options that genuinely restores citizen sovereignty, escapes federal authoritarianism, and constructs a polity oriented toward the future. Conclusion. A call to reflection, resistance, and rebuilding. We stand at a crossroads. The seemingly stable constitutional order has been corroded by incremental compromises, executive aggrandizement, institutional inertia, and the normalization of force. The Trump presidency does not mark a rupture so much as a climax of underlying pathologies: the drift towards centralization, the erosion of civilian oversight, the weaponization of state power, and the collapse of institutional legitimacy. But tyranny is not destiny, it is a condition to be resisted. Drawing on Spooner, Henry, Jefferson, Madison, Jackson, and Kennedy, we see that the classical Republican tradition gives us both the diagnosis and the guardrails of response: constrain authority, defend natural rights, localize power, maintain vigilant citizenship, and demand that institutions serve people rather than dominate them. The Cascadia Plan, though audacious, offers a moral, structural, and political experiment, a living lab of how a free, ecologically minded, decentralized, and transparently governed society might function. For the independent-minded, for the skeptics of both left and right, it proposes a path that does not surrender to authoritarian drift, nor abandon governance entirely, but reboots it from the ground up. Let this be a call, not to immediate revolution, but to conscious political renewal. Resist authoritarian impulses in the present. Support institutional reform where possible. Help create alternative polities where necessary. And above all, refuse the idea that the only choices are big state tyranny or chaotic absence of order. We can, and must, build something better: a republic of free, flourishing citizens.